Thank you so much. I think this was a really beautiful impulse into what we're going to discuss now. But before we do that, I will also properly introduce you and Carla as well. Um, so I start with you, Lisa. You are a visual artist based between Puerto Rico and Ghana. Your work weaves photography, installation, and sculpture with the botanical universe. Large-scale installations in convivial settings reimagine landscapes, cartography, and rhizomatic patterns to explore connections and disconnections to nature and home. You're currently in the doctorate program at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana, in the painting and sculpture department. You have exhibited in abundant monumental buildings in Ghana, such as the unfinished John Kufuor Memorial Library, as well as institutions including the CNUS Botanical Gardens, at the Goethe Institute in Salvador, in the Portland Museum of Art, at the Amasaka Gallery in Uganda, Wallach Art Gallery in New York, and the Museum of Latin American Art in Los Angeles, as well as the Corredor Afro in Puerto Rico. You created your first permanent installation for the MacArthur Switching Station project designed by David Edge in New York. And you have lectured at the MIT, the Ford Foundation, and Rutgers University, and you were a resident at the Villa Sul in 2023, where the theme was post-colonial presence. And Carla is a documentary filmmaker, artist, and educator based in Lajas, Puerto Rico. Currently, Carla is producing their first feature film, Matinano, a hybrid documentary directed by Gabriela App and supported by Topic Studios, Doc Society, Sundance Film Institute, and Ford Foundation. Claudio's last short film, The New Indigo Wave from 2024, was an official selection at the 2025 Tribeca Film Festival, the 2025 Santa Fe International Film Festival, and the 2026 Vieques, Human Rights and Film Festival, and featured in season 38 of PBS POV Shorts. Their videos and experiments with natural pigments and dyes have been featured at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, the Whitney Museum of American Art, also in New York, the Design Museum of Miramar in San Juan in Puerto Rico, and Tenerife Espacio de las Artes in Tenerife, among many others. They were selected to participate in the 2023 Sundance Producers Intensive, the 2024 Sundance Latinx Fellowship, and the Caribbean Film Academy Fellowship at the 2023 Third Horizon Film Festival. And you were a resident in 2025 in Salvador under this theme of recognized limits. So, yes, as I mentioned before, we're moving more into the ecosystems and how these are kind of often also marginalized by urban structures. And you both have your very specific approaches looking into that further. And as we just have seen your work, I would start with you, Lisa, also. Maybe you could go a bit more deeper into your practice that moves between film and performance and writing, and how you see how that, how you kind of translate your ideas in terms of connecting with nature and the ecosystem into these kind of visual tools that we then can actually perceive here in this context or in other contexts.
Thank you very much, Yvette. And thank you all for being here. I think it's easiest to explain my work when I started my master's in Kumasi at KNUST in 2020 by growing a garden. So it was how I decided to begin new work and where to cultivate new ideas and where to create a methodology and where the materials would come from. So the garden provided all of this. It took me a little time to realize that this wasn't an original idea in my family. In fact, my family, we come from both Jamaica and Puerto Rico. And though I didn't grow up in the islands, I grew up in New York City. Wherever we moved to, we always grew a garden. And the reference was always my great aunt's garden in Mandeville. So though she lived in a town, it's kind of between rural and urban, and so there was land and space besides the house. And so she grew a kind of jungle in front of the house, and from there she ate most of her food. And she also cultivated decorative flowers and had a nursery for herbal medicines, right? So I realized that this has all influenced the work that I started going into. And from this space, then it led me into the work, and it allowed for me to use different materials. Before this, I was using industrial materials, wires, mylar, fishing line, cement. And I decided to go deeper into, okay, where does this all come from? And looking at the earth, and then dealing with mycelium, learning about it, researching it, and then it's hosting relationships to plants and trees. And so I normally do not put the body into, or the human form into my work. So with the plants, I was doing photography, I was doing screen printing of drawings from the garden. I was learning about the plants, or what we call weeds, and realizing those are our doctors. They're our first responders to both the earth and to our bodies. And so I saw it as my interaction was the body included. Or when I do a work installation, the viewers become participants and they complete the work. So when I went to Villa Sul, I knew that I had wanted to start incorporating my body into working with plants in some way, responding to them, understanding them. But I didn't know how to do this, only by instinct, which I felt wasn't enough. I needed a base. And when I went to Villa Sul, I was led to UFPA, the university there, where there are specific professors who teach somatic technique, which is when I learned this term. And somatic technique is a response not only to your interior, but to your environment. So there began the work, the research, the lessons that eventually led to the video that you saw. It was a very interesting learning experience because you start to realize how much we have forgotten and how disconnected we are from our environments. To be reconnected was when I realized how disconnected we are. I grew up in a city, even though we always created these spaces, right, these natural spaces of nutritional support, and a place of you grow a garden and your body immediately relaxes, right? So there's this conversation that's you're having, but you're not really realizing. And learning somatic technique put me deep into this understanding and realize how much we have forgotten. And then coming from the Caribbean, there's so much knowledge that was passed on through my grandparents, through my great aunties, that it all started to come back in this form. And that was how I started to re-understand my work, myself, and us as humans on this planet, and how we are interacting, but also what has been erased, why it has been erased, through what systems of erasure that we have grown up in, basically at this point, and then think about, okay, so what's next? Specifically, the work, it's a very straightforward parallel. It's dealing with the third oldest church in Brazil that was built by the Jesuits in 1505, I believe. And it was this church that was put into this Brazilian, this at the time it was this environment that now we know as Brazil, as an imposer, right? They're imposing this structure and imposing the system from which the structure will be holding and implementing into society. And as time went on, you go through the whole abandonment, like the use of this structure and what it did to the communities around, how it transformed them in the ways that it did through colonization and implementation of this particular religion, etc. And then the abandonment of it, and then you're dealing with the environment, which was ignored, right? So the environment was clear to build this church, and then it was maintained for a certain time. When abandoned, the plants continued. They didn't pay its authority any mind. And the gameleira tree specifically, so the title is I Like the Gameleira Tree, took over to the point that now those walls are held by the gameleira tree branches. Oh. And it is intrinsically one at this point. You can't take one apart from the other without killing it, without destroying the rest of the structure, or without killing the gameleira tree. And I see it as a direct parallel of us as Caribbean peoples and diasporan peoples, that we are originally coming from the African continent, our roots. I know my roots are Igbo on the Jamaican side, but my mixture has the colonizer in me. I have the Spanish in me. But if you were to extract that from me, you would destroy me. So I have to now come to terms with what I am, all of it, the despised as well as the loved, because that is who I am, and that is my whole now. That's my new whole. It's a new structure, it's a new architecture. So then, obviously, it's a reference for much of the work that I'm talking about. And of course, with these plants I'm dealing with, where did these plants come from? The garden I grew in Kumasi in Ghana. Do we have the same plants in Puerto Rico and Jamaica? So this is what I was comparing. Where did they originally come from? Where did it come from, and then brought through transatlantic slavery or trade before or after, etc. So all of those conversations are in the work, and why I do the work is to learn about us, but through the plants instead of through us, because our knowledges are faulty and they are fragmented, and so much erasure, as we've been talking about a lot in these mornings here, has been implemented. And I feel like I can get back some of that erasure. I can relearn that knowledge is sitting there, because I see the land, forests, the sea, the bodies of water as our original libraries. So the flora are our original archives. So there's much to learn. And then the beings that interact with the insects and so on and so on. So all the non-human beings also hold knowledges. So I'm paying attention to all of this, and the garden brought me there. That's a place.
Yeah. Thank you so much also for contextualizing your work. And maybe before we come to you, Carla, I would just want to ask you maybe to go a little bit deeper into this idea of these hidden histories that are, part of these plants, and how nature is also an archive as much as our bodies are, and how this comes together. I think it's a really beautiful and striking example that you gave with the church, but also, I mean, you've done a lot of research in relation to that, and maybe you can unpack it a little bit more when you say, this, that you see these ecosystems as our libraries of the broader human histories and knowledge also.
In terms of more examples, or
Yeah,
just, yeah. I mean, I think about, for example, I think about, again, weeds. So my first exhibition in Kumasi at that time was called mala yerba, which is known as weeds, bad grass. And I started to investigate, who are these beings? Why are they popping up here after dry season has ended and rainy season has begun? Why them? What are they doing? Who are they? And the further I went into them, the first thing that I found out through research was that they are known as what they're called first responders, which means that the earth is basically calling them to come and heal the earth. So whether it's a tractor that's disturbing the earth or a bear in the forest disturbing the earth, they are called by the soil to implement nitrogen, hydrogen, to revive. This also comes from birds dropping seeds. And so in some ways, plants invite other plants. So as they grow, they start to create their own communities. And it's very, let's call it multicultural communities. It's not this mono crop that we're used to, that all plants grow, in one space together. That doesn't exist in nature, because they protect each other and they have different abilities to help each other out. So if you have all the same plant, for example, you have one particular insect that likes this plant. If there isn't a whole community, a diverse community, they'll easily be wiped out, right? So that's just a kind of standard example. But as I got to understand the nutritional value also of these plants, not only for humans, but for other non-human beings, it started to make sense that there's this huge community on this earth that is there for specific reasons and specific ways, that we can start to relearn who we are as beings on this earth by just paying attention to something as simple as what we would call weeds. So that was kind of my entry point to begin to dive further into this work. I mean, there's more to say, but yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. But I think it made it, it was good to have this other example to see also the broadness of what you're talking about, and that we encounter it like actually every day, and everyone can actually, if we want to, and we learn to see it.
It's completely accessible.
Yeah.
It wasn't like you have to be in university to understand what this plant is that's growing on the sidewalk. Yeah.
Carla, it's very related. Your work is very related to what Lisa does, and maybe you could just, share with the audience a little bit more about, your work when it comes to the connection between non-human life and the habitat, and maybe also speaking about the more specific projects that you've been doing. Also in Bahia, and how you translate that. I mean, you brought a magazine that you produced in Bahia, but also, as we've heard, you are like a filmmaker. So it's very different tools that you use to address these topics.
Yes, I call it my techie and my messy disciplines, which I kind of need both. So my interest in plants and invasive plants specifically started, I would say, so I studied, I did a bachelor's in fine arts in film and in new genres. And I was doing a lot of video editing. I was kind of frustrated with dealing with computers and screens, kind of had this like existential crisis in my 20s. I also moved back to Puerto Rico, and I had really focused on being a video artist. And when I went to Puerto Rico, no one was hiring video artists. So I had to work in commercials in the film industry there. And it was very frustrating because it's all commercial, it's all American, US companies, US productions, where you don't really see at the moment, you didn't see women or queer women in top creative positions. So it was very discouraging. And I guess in that crisis, also to take care of my mental health, I started to look at herbalism. And And once in Puerto Rico in 2012, because I had studied in the United States, so I moved back to Puerto Rico in 2012. I was becoming familiar with the fact that we do not have a very secure food sovereignty in Puerto Rico. We import 80% of the food that we consume. So I started to learn more about agroecology and also about how invasive plants and weeds have been part of our traditions, culinary traditions, and complemented our diets. And so in that process, I started with a friend of mine, Natalia Muñoz Paralitici, also an artist in Puerto Rico. We started a project called La Recolecta, or The Foragers, which started off as an editorial project. We wanted to make zines about wild plants, including recipes, testimonies, both prioritizing popular knowledge and also scientific knowledge from researchers and academia. And in that process, I went back also to visual arts and drawing and more kind of like sensorial practices, not so much in my mind. And as I was making drawings of plants, and also I visited an artisan during those years called Alice Chéveres. She's an indigenous Taino potter in Morovis, Puerto Rico, and she harvests her or collects her clay from right next to her house in the river, and I had never seen that in Puerto Rico. You grow up thinking that you are lacking all these resources in Puerto Rico, and I think this happens in many countries where you feel you need to the clay here is not good enough. You need to buy it, you need to import it. And this blew my mind. There were many artists that were visiting this workshop, and they started to bring clays from different parts of the island. And I would see the different colors, and I thought, oh, maybe I can make my own paints and expand this idea of food sovereignty to a material sovereignty. Bring back the cultural practice of really looking at the biodiversity around me, at the resources or the elemental forces around me, to be able to collaborate and sustain my visual art practice. And I started with that, with studying mineral pigments to make my paintings, make my illustrations. And then I moved on to plants. I started with mineral pigments because they do not fade with the sun, and they are, I guess, more commercially viable. And then I moved to plants, and thinking how invasive plants could offer me options to create my own pigments and colors. So in the last 5-7 years, I have been researching this, studying this, so when I applied for the residency, I was really interested in working with collective spaces for growing plants, for growing food, medicine, interested in urban gardens. So my approach there was to visit these spaces and volunteer, get to know the people there. And I also knew, researching beforehand, that a lot of these plants that were in Puerto Rico were in Bahia as well, which I find that fascinating about invasive plants, because they are like immigrants almost, and they serve almost as a common language between different cultures, different locations. So that was my approach, starting to talk with people about, for example, coentro de India, which I know as recao, which is one of the most important plants in Puerto Rican diet, culinary practices. And I wanted to make, this was an idea I had from a very long time ago, I wanted to make a shopper using a little bit the aesthetic of consumer culture, of advertising, and to create a shopper that was intervened by invasive plants that would include testimonies and recipes that I learned during my time there. That also comes from an interest that I had initially in college upon learning about the situation as international, the board, and culture jamming, appropriating, right? The language of magazines, of retail, and kind of twisting it and showing these systems of power that are inherited in it, and also using it as a resources, like stealing it and and shaping it in a way that I saw fit. So yeah, that was the idea. That's where the idea of the Catálogo das Plantas Subversivas, which in Puerto Rico, we call them like choppers. Choppers, it's like an Anglicism. And in Brazil, they call the Catálogo de Supermercado. So that's why it's Catálogo das Plantas Subversivas. In the process, I have learned that this word subversive it's not a word to be thrown around recently. Has given me some trouble, especially in the airport where they saw the publications. But yeah, that was the idea. I also experiment with dye plants in Bahia. I had the privilege to be able to work with Pau Brasil, Pau Brasilia equinata, which is the tree that gave the country its name. You cannot get it commercially. It's illegal to harvest it and sell it. So in the botanical garden of Salvador, I met an employee and he was able to gift me a little bit of Pau Brazil that was left over from maintenance in the garden. And I made an anthotype animation. I wanted to also experiment with anthotypes. Anthotypes are photographies that are made with botanical inks and exposed with the sun over time. So I wanted to experiment doing an animation. A lot of the research I did it in the company of Mickey Yu, who was also a resident there and who's here in the audience. And in the video, the animation, it is Mickey Yu's hands doing a transplant of a Pau Brazil tree into a bigger pot. So the animation is made with Pau Brazil ink, and it's about this transplanting of the tree.
Wow, super interesting. Just as a side note, you can also, after this talk, have a look at the shoppers because they are like there on the table, so you can then browse through. I would have one more question, and I always like to have the big questions at the end. I was just wondering, because we talked about ecologies as social infrastructures, so I was wondering about your idea if we would turn it around and we would have these ecosystems at the centers of urban structures and not as an afterthought, because so far also in the previous conversation it was like that, yes, there are these ecosystems, but in the broader picture of urban planning, they're always like, yeah, kind of afterthought or brought in at some point, but not really considered. So how could that shift if we would turn that around and actually they would be the starting point of the habitat where then the humans would come in? So yeah, would be interested to hear how you would imagine that.
Well, I actually have been working a bit in that realm because I am dealing with abandoned structures in Ghana. So I have also done my installations. Though it started in front of my house in my garden, then I moved to other spaces, including what you had read, which is the, they call it unfinished, I say abandoned, building of President John Kufuor, which was supposed to be his memorial library. So they had started the structure. It is there. It's quite prominent. It's on campus, actually. But it has been left since 2011. There's a plaque paid by the German government, actually. But it has not been, let's say, continued. In that specific space, they have a guard, which means that they every month or so, they clean it, which means that they're taking out the weeds. but the structure remains as is. It hasn't even been plastered, so it's very, very basic, but huge 3-level structure. But I remember going there over a year time to see the space and noticing like boko boko, which is a particular plant that grows everywhere in Ghana, and you can eat it. It's a kind of superfood, as so many of these weeds are. And I was very excited about it growing there, and I wanted to interact with it in some way. But when I came back, it was gone. So I could see that they had been removing, and that's what was considered cleaning, right? But I did a 2-level installation there, which includes what were known as death mats, but now are called sleeping mats. As a convivial space, I laid out these mats, have local games, local instruments, and make teas from the surrounding plants. So I've done this in a number of spaces, 2 spaces on campus that have been abandoned. The second one was supposed to be the largest veterinarian hospital in all of West Africa. Again, it's about 4 levels. It's a different configuration. And there they've left it so that there's a huge ecosystem of plants growing in the middle of it. And the cows actually come and sleep there at night and leave during the day. It's abandoned, mind you, but there's so many different rooms and spaces in which they were supposed to have the surgeries and such, right, for animals. And so again, I intervened with this kind of intervention in this space and brought an audience there, which I would consider as participants, to interact in this space, to see what happens. I did this again in Uganda, in another space that again is surrounded by plants, forest and so on, but it's again a structure that has been unused for some time, and they were trying to reuse it. So I've been implementing this idea of spaces within the context of cities and urbanscapes, but abandoned structures that then have plant life around it, and then kind of bringing that back into note, because it really is part of the work. It's not just the mats and so on where I lay out, or the T-shirts and flags that I made with the plants that are surrounding there, but the plants themselves. And there is quite an interesting conversation that begins. I also created questionnaires regarding plants, people's relationship to plants, what your grandmother made for you when you were sick from plants specifically, what do you remember, how did you make your watercolors, did you make it from flowers, and are you uncomfortable in nature, in natural environments? Like this tension, right? We have this tension now between our bodies being nature, but considering everything around us is nature in terms of natural environments, but not us. We've separated ourselves even in the way we speak. I'm going into nature, but you are nature. So these conversations I try to induce through creating these activities, creating these spaces. The questionnaires, again, that creates these conversations, and then and making teas. And the teas are not just normal teas, they're not from a tea bag, they are harvested, and therefore there's questions about what is this, and then what does it do for you? Like, how does this give nutritional value to your body? And that begins a lot of conversations. So for me, the final work are those conversations that are happening in the context of setting this situation up in these both urban, natural spaces, in order for us to start to think out of the box and start to remember our relationship and who we are.
Thank you.
Yes, I think definitely a mixture of public policy, pushing forward public policy to create these green spaces in cities, very important, and also grassroots organizing. That is something that is happening a lot in Puerto Rico already, especially after Hurricane Maria in 2017. The city, most of all, people in the city, including myself, did not have access to fresh food, and that was provocation for people to start occupying abandoned buildings and abandoned lots to start making these gardens. And that is something, that's a space that I have been able to organize workshops, organize herb walks, and social gatherings. For example, there is a garden in San Juan called San Mateo del Batatal. It was a garden that I was participating from 2020 to 2023. And it was like a very important space. And you know, you think about creating these spaces, and I think people sometimes have this expectation that is for producing food, and they're like, oh, how much food are you producing? And it's not necessarily the point. If you have worked or volunteered in a urban garden, it's a place for healing, it's a place for gathering, for for being surrounded again by biodiversity, non-human species, and yeah, it's also important, I think, in Puerto Rico to regulate the use of glyphosate. Glyphosate is rampantly used, also known as Roundup.
Pesticide.
It's a herbicide to destroy herbs on the sidewalk, and I think it's a little bit more regulated here in Europe, or sometimes I think in some places banned even. But in Puerto Rico it is not. And just to find a more intelligent way to manage invasive species that really perhaps they are threatening local biodiversity, but they were brought here or brought there by humans. So there needs to be kind of a better way to manage them, giving them some sort of like economic outlet or some sort of use, because they're so abundant, they're so aggressive, so might as well use that in some sort of creative way.
Yeah, it reminds me, the last series I did a photo transfer series of images of the landscape of Loíza, which is a town in Puerto Rico, and the western region of Ghana. But I did it I superimposed or did the photo transfers onto this paper, which is mulberry paper. And what I learned was it was gifted to me, the paper. And so I did my research about the mulberry paper. And the mulberry plant was brought from either China or Japan. You hear from both. In the 60s, 1960 basically, or 59 or so, to Ghana in order to create these bespoke publishing companies throughout the region. So this was a Kwame Nkrumah initiative, like he was doing also with bricks, creating brick factories in different regions so that they could be building that was more bespoke and not so this large international industry, but it was locally made. And so this plant was brought there, placed into forest reserves in Kumasi in order that they start to propagate this and grow it in different parts, that they can then make the paper from this plant, because it makes a very, very thin, beautiful, strong paper, and then create books. When the coup happened, this idea vanished, of course. It was also toppled, but the plant, because you keep using invasive, so it reminds me of this. This plant is known as an invasive species now because it flourished. It really didn't care about the coup or who was in charge or anything. That's what I find fascinating about plants. They do not care about the authority that humans put. Even with the pesticide, they will grow somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And
Or mutate.
they learn,
Yeah.
they mutate. Yeah, they really evolve in different forms, but they continue. And it has flourished throughout the whole country. And we can still now do the same thing. They want you to take these plants and rip them out of the earth, and you can take them in order to make paper. We can still do this idea. It's still possible, right? And it's even more prevalent because now it's, 50 years later, it's in most parts of Ghana. And so there is this material resource to make this beautiful material that then we can pass these, potentially utopian-like ideas of how we can become what's next for us, right? How can we move beyond these structures and systems and oppressive ways into a place that we were perhaps in the past, because I think about you have to go back to the past in order to go to the future, taking these indigenous or ancient knowledges and then put it into context of what's coming. So I think, yes, and plants is our way. They're even talking about going to Mars and all these different planets, and how are they going to do it? The only way they can do it is through mycelium. They have to start with mycelium. They're the host, they're the ones that the plants all have the relationship with, and they're the ones that give this nutritional value and support system to the plants. On the 90% of the plants on Earth, terrestrial plants, is mycelium. So they're looking at mycelium to take to Mars and other planets in order to think about how to create a system, a space, a world in which humans can inhabit. And it can only be through plants. So this constantly killing and constantly cementing, it's not sustainable. That is not sustainable.
Also, the prevalence of like the idea of, or the cultural practice of monoculture. I think of activist and physicist Vandana Shiva. She has a book called Monocultures of the Mind, and there's a quote that says, "Life diversity in nature corresponds to life diversity in cultures," and that I think is really at the heart too of like the need of creating these green spaces in cities, of thinking how really the seed of all cultures is certainly this like human impulse for expression and this human impulse to pass on memory, but also material culture particularly comes from that relationship with the biodiversity around you, with the elemental forces and the non-human species. So that blew my mind when I read this quote, because you see in the United States and in many places, also in Europe, practices of monoculture kind of go in hand with these, for example, like food chains and like franchises and strip malls that are like exactly the same in the West Coast and the East Coast, and it's like the same food. So that goes in hand, no, with this, also with this cultural practice of monoculture. So yeah, that kind of opened my mind when I read that quote. Also thinking about the, well, it's life diversity in nature corresponds to life diversity in cultures. So defending biodiversity, you're really defending like diversity in cultures and in humans.
Yeah, it makes me think of Sylvia Wynter and a lot of what she has been writing about and talking about, going beyond the human domination, and that the environment is not this neutral place for us to dominate, but it's a place in its own for us to learn from and to exchange with and to grow from. It's our support system.
Thank you both. I think this is a good note to end the conversation, at least here in this setup. Thank you for sharing this. I think it really also complemented very well the conversation that we had before when we talked about the human habitants in the city and how, we all have to live together really to make it work.